Hi everyone, in this video we're going to run through a top 10 of opening traps, and whilst I wouldn't advocate going out of your way to play for opening traps, it is good to have an awareness that these exist so that if you come across one of these positions you know how to play this trap, and also it helps you avoid falling into these traps yourself. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video, and do smash that like button to help these videos reach more people. So we're going to start here with a trap called the Noah's Ark Trap, and this features in a variation of the Roy Lopez. So I'll play through these opening moves here because they are fairly standard. White brings out the bishop and it gets kicked away. Black plays d6, and now in this position the most common way for white to play is pushing pawn to c3. Castling is also very often seen, but here white instead plays pawn to d4. Not necessarily the best move, but it does very quickly gain some space. Black now pushes the bishop away with b5, bishop drops into b3, and now the black knight jumps in and takes on d4. White recaptures here, black takes back with the e-pawn, and now if white recaptures this pawn with the queen, this is the trap that white has now fallen into, because black now has the very strong response, pawn to c5. Gaining a tempo on the queen and now threatening to trap the bishop once the queen moves away. So if we imagine that white drops the queen into d5, threatening checkmate on f7 and also hitting the rook on a8, black can now respond with bishop e6, defending the checkmate and also defending the rook with the queen. And here white can throw in a check, but after bishop d7, queen d5, now you can go c4 and the bishop here is trapped. The next trap we're going to look at is the Légal Trap, and it starts from this king's pawn position again. Here white plays bishop c4 instead of bishop b5, and black now responds by playing pawn to d6, a slightly dubious move because although it gives the centre some support, it neglects developing pieces. White now brings another knight out. Black now plays bishop into g4. Again, black should really be developing the king side here as opposed to the queen side. White now kicks this bishop with h3, and black now makes the position worse by dropping this bishop back to h5. After committing the bishop to g4, that exchange of bishop for knight really had to be made, especially when you see the beautiful trap that black has now fallen into, and that's knight takes e5, a really nice queen sacrifice, because after bishop takes d1, we now have the killer move, bishop takes f7 check, and after king e7 only move, the second white knight jumps into d5, giving a beautiful checkmate on e7 using the three minor pieces. Our next opening trap is known as the Elephant Trap or Cambridge Springs Trap, and we're joining the position here in a Queen's Gambit declined. It's white to move and they bring the bishop out to g5, pinning the knight on f6 of course. And black decides to set a trap for white, which is by playing knight b to d7. White now takes the pawn on d5, and after black recaptures with the e-pawn, the trap is set. So if white were to jump in here and chop off this d-pawn, trying to use the fact that this knight on f6 is pinned by the bishop, black can actually go ahead and take this knight regardless, and after white takes the queen on d8, black now has the very powerful response, bishop to b4 check. And the only way to block here is for white to play queen to d2, after which we chop the queen, king takes back, black takes the bishop on d8, and as you can see, black has now emerged a piece up. Our fourth opening trap is known as the Lasker Trap, named after the second world champion Emanuel Lasker. This trap emerges out of the aggressive Albin counter gambit opening, so when white plays the Queen's Gambit here, black responds by playing pawn to e5, and this is the start of the Albin counter gambit. After white captures this pawn on e5, black pushes on with the d-pawn to claim some space, and if white immediately challenges this pawn with pawn to e3, this is unfortunately a serious mistake that allows black to spring a deadly trap. So after bishop to b4, if white now blocks with his own bishop, one of the most natural moves in the position, black now has the very strong response, pawn takes on e3. And if white now takes the material that black is offering on b4, then black has the strong response, pawn takes f2 with check. If the white king recaptures this pawn, then the queen is lost on d1. And after king to e2, the really nice part of this trap is that black now captures the g1 knight and under promotes to a knight himself. And at this point, the white rook can't even recapture that knight, because then we have the deadly bishop g4 skewering the king and queen. So after this sequence of moves, white is completely lost, And if we run the position back here, even if white doesn't take the bishop on b4 and simply recaptures the pawn on e3, the white position is still very dire after the move queen to h4, and if g3 we then have queen e4 hitting the rook in the corner, and after a move like, let's say, knight f3, black picks up a further pawn on e3 with check, because the bishop on d2 is pinned to the king, and after, say, bishop e2, we can chop the bishop on d2, and black has a winning advantage here. Our fifth opening trap comes from another variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. We pick the position up here after black has just played castles. White now brings a rook to the c-file, and black brings a rook across to the e-file. White now develops the queen onto the c-file, and black plays a6, preparing a later c-pawn advance and covering this b5 square. White now takes in the centre and black recaptures. We have bishop d3 developing, c6 to support this d5 pawn, castles from white, knight e4 from black. White drops the bishop back to f4, and now this is where the trap begins. So black should play a normal move, like say knight d to f6, but instead black decides to play pawn to f5, solidifying this knight on e4. So if you want to pause the video here and look for the deadly trap that white can spring, then do so. White plays knight takes d5, and after pawn recaptures, we have bishop c7, trapping the black queen. Certainly one of the more unusual traps, and a really nice queen checkmate to finish the position. Our next opening trap comes from the Smith-Morra Gambit line of the Sicilian. So white plays e4, we have c5, d4, c takes d4, and now c3, initiating the Smith-Morra Gambit. Black accepts the gambit, white recaptures with the knight. We have knight to c6, knight f3, pawn to e6, bishop c4, queen c7, castles, knight f6, and now queen e2 from white. And here black sets up a trap for white by playing knight g4. And if white now plays h3 to kick this knight away, this is where the trap is now sprung. Black now plays knight to d4. And the problem here is that the white knight on f3 is simply overloaded. The move that white would like to play is knight takes d4, but then we have queen h2 checkmate. If white takes the knight on g4, then we simply lose our queen. And if we try and retreat the queen out of the line of attack, then the black knight on d4 can simply chop on f3, and after queen takes, again we have this h2 mate. Our next trap is known as the Fajarowicz Trap, and it comes from a variation of the Budapest Gambit. So white plays d4, knight f6, c4, e5, initiating the Budapest Gambit. White accepts with pawn takes e5, knight e4, white develops a knight to f3, and now black plays the aggressive d6, giving another pawn if white wants it. Now white should really decline this extra pawn and simply develop a piece, perhaps playing queen c2 to hit this aggressively placed knight, but instead white accepts the gambit in this position. Black now brings the bishop out, and here if white plays what looks like a natural looking move, pawn to g3 to look to fianchetto this bishop, then black can now jump in with the excellent knight takes f2, and after king takes we have bishop takes g3 check, and after pawn takes the white queen is lost on d1. And this is always a theme to look out for when the queen is undefended like this and there's an f2 weakness. Our next trap is known as the Blackburne Shilling Trap and comes from a variation of the king's pawn opening. You often see traps like this from way back in the 1800s being played. So white plays e4, black pushes e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and now black plays the very dubious move knight d4, moving a piece for a second time straight out of the opening. Now white should just chop this knight on d4 and take the fact that he's then got a centre and is ahead in development. But instead, if white plays the greedy knight takes e5, this now gives black counterplay. Black can play queen to g5, hitting the pawn on g2 and leaving this f7 pawn on prise. If white jumps in and takes a second pawn, forking queen and rook, then the trap is now sprung in earnest. Black can take on g2, and after rook f1, queen takes e4 check, bishop e2, we now have the nice smothered mate with the knight, knight f3, checkmate. Our next trap is known as the Englund Gambit, and I can't tell you the number of times I've come across this trap in Blitz, and you only really fall for it a couple of times and then you learn how to play against it. So after d4, black plays pawn to e5, white takes this pawn, knight c6 hitting the pawn, knight f3 defending, and now black plays a sneaky queen move, queen to e7, and the most obvious way to defend this pawn for white is playing bishop to f4, which in itself isn't a bad move, but now it allows black to play queen b4 check, forking king and bishop, and so bishop d2 is forced, and after queen takes b2, the most obvious move for white to play here is bishop c3, defending the rook in the corner, and also bringing this bishop to a nice diagonal. However, this runs straight into the trap, bishop b4, and now the only way for white to seemingly hold everything together is to play queen d2, but actually this runs straight into a problem because after bishop takes on c3, queen takes bishop to hold on to the rook, and now black has checkmate in 1, queen c1. So coming back to this position, after black takes on b2, the much better move here is to simply play knight c3, and black is in all sorts of trouble. If he plays bishop b4, now we can simply respond rook b1, queen has to give ground, and now probably the strongest way to play is knight b5, and black is picking up all sorts of tempos against the queen, threatening the pawn on c7, the bishops will soon be exchanged, and white is ahead in development, as well as having a very serious initiative. Our final opening trap is called the fishing pole trap, and this is really one of the oldest tricks in the book. So white plays pawn to e4, we have pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, starting off the Roy Lopez, knight to f6, castles, and now knight g4. Not the best move, but it is trying to set up a hidden trap for white. So white plays pawn h3, which is a decent move, and now black sets the trap for white by playing pawn h5. Now if white simply ignores what's going on the king side and continues building up a massive grip in the centre with say pawn c3, then white will be way ahead in this game. However, if white gets greedy and takes this knight, now the trap is sprung, pawn takes on g4, the knight is forced to move away, and now the queen jumps onto the h-file with devastating effect, threatening mate on h1, and the only way to give the king an escape square is by pushing the f-pawn, but the problem here is now black just shuts the trap with pawn to g3, there's no escape on f2, and the checkmate on the h-file is inevitable. So after say pawn to d4, queen h2 is checkmate. So I hope you enjoyed this run through of 10 opening traps that you need to look out for. As always, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and I hope to see you again in another video.